India is launching one of the world's largest international repatriation missions. Flights to 13 countries will start on Thursday, while warships have already been deployed to bring back hundreds of thousands of workers stranded overseas due to coronavirus travel restrictions. All flights to India were suspended in late March. Arriving passengers will be screened, segregated and then quarantined. Kyriakose Vegase is a lawyer practicing at the Indian Supreme Court. He's representing an Indian expat who's filed a case for speedy evacuation. Good to have you with us live on Al Jazeera, sir. Who are you representing and what's the backstory to your client?
I represent a client, an Indian citizen who is based in the UAE by the name of one Mr. Sunil Aziz. He's been very actively involved with the diaspora, amongst the Indian diaspora in UAE. And he flagged this issue, stating that a lot of marginalized and the poorer sections of the diaspora are finding it extremely difficult. Their livelihood is affected. Conditions in labor camps seems to be, completely a challenging aspect. And he also highlighted the concern that, citizens are unable to return back to their homeland. Based on the same, then we decided to initiate a public interest litigation in the Supreme Court of India, flagging some of the concerns of our fellow citizens who are trapped in countries like the UAE. UAE primarily because it has the largest number of expatriates of Indian origin there. The petition seeks to, one, highlight the broad issues which are being faced there and for the evolution of a proper protocol, a proper legal framework on which this entire evacuation efforts of the government of India could be kind of underpinned. We felt that there's a huge legal vacuum in which this entire process of evacuation potentially may operate, and that was a concern which we are trying to bring before the Supreme Court. Okay. Because we look at evacuation not only as a movement of people from point A to point B, but as a whole process of screening, starting from point A, from the host country, to make sure that they're asymptomatic, ensure that once they come back to India, the larger state governments are in a position to handle these multitudes which come in and to ensure that they're quarantined.
Well, let me just interject there. Sorry, let me just interject there, and we'll take this piece by piece. Let's talk about the fact that your client will be moving from the UAE to India. So what's his understanding of being tested at the moment in the UAE and the approach that he will receive once he lands on Indian soil?
He is, of course, acting in the larger public interest. But one of the concerns which he was highlighting in the UAE was that, the number of people which are there, especially as expats from South Asia and more particularly from India, the numbers are so high that effective screening in these labor camps may be very challenging. And he felt that a lot of these people would like to return, especially people who are not affected or not infected at this stage. If they're asymptomatic, he felt that it is better in today's conditions and the kind of economic difficulty people are facing. He felt that it would be better for them to come back to their homeland and to ensure that they go through the quarantine process and that they're able to be back home. This was one of the concerns he had highlighted, and he is more than willing to be subjected to whatever medical test and screening is there, not only in the UAE, but presumably within the Indian states as well.
You talk about the framework that you'd like to see the Indian government implement for the movement of people both from respective countries back to India itself. Are you confident that the Indian government can do this, considering they couldn't, or they were perceived not to be able to move domestic migrant workers from one state to the next because of trains, planes and buses being halted and people couldn't get back to their home villages?
The initial issue pertaining to migrant workers happened during the midst of the lockdown, and it was an unprecedented lockdown starting from Sunday of March, late Sunday. And the lockdown led to a complete closure of state borders, and workers were trapped. Today, what has happened is there's a conditional lifting of the lockdown process. So today, I think legally speaking, the lockdown has been lifted. The government of India, like even the state governments, they're looking at a very unprecedented situation. It is not like it's not even like a normal disturbance or a war, where India in 1991 during the Gulf War lifted almost 1 million plus people from Kuwait. But that was a case where you lifted people and brought them back home, and they could just go home, walk home. There were no international pandemics or public health emergencies which stop them from moving around. Today, the position is different because you now have to ensure that the masses of people are being brought into a plane. The first threshold checking happens at the airport. So you have to ensure that the checking there happens, so which means there's a lot of involvement of the government of India with the host country. Once that is done, once they're transported back, the state governments have a whole process of quarantining these thousands of people to ensure that food is given to them, to ensure medicines are given, ensure clean water, hygienic conditions, lest you have a bigger disaster waiting to happen. What we were trying to point out was actually the lack of a proper framework. And we believe that a proper protocol, a proper legal protocol or a procedure established by law would enable the returning people to be not discriminated if at all there is an arbitrariness or some kind of non-transparency in the process. As lawyers, we felt, or as the client felt at that stage, that people should be given an even chance to come back and not merely based on their paying capacity. So this was a concern which...
Sorry, no, I didn't mean to interrupt because we're running out of time, but just a brief and final question. Repatriation for any national from any country is never a free ticket back home. For many of the migrant workers that are coming back from the Gulf, they went to the Gulf because they come from poor backgrounds and send most of their money back to India to support their families. Can they afford the airline ticket to get them back home?
See, I believe most of the people whom we're talking about who are really marginalized and not very capable of having a savings culture, because I'm sure they send money back. Like you pointed out, there's a huge amount of remittance coming back, and these people contribute in a big way back to their local economy. Now, this is a time when I believe the government of India should at least, if not, free tickets may be very challenging, but the government could look at subsidizing or heavily discounting these tickets, especially for people who can be identified to be people who do not have the economic capability of buying that elusive ticket back home. I think there the government probably, or rather, if I may use a rather strong way of putting it, the government is duty-bound to ensure that its people come back home without, after the screening process is done, and that ticket should be something which the government should be looking at people who cannot afford it. I think that is a primary duty of all governments. People who can pay for it, well, good.
Indeed. Kyriakos Vergase, thanks so much for joining us from New Delhi. Really appreciate your time.